The 911 call came into the Philadelphia Emergency Response Center at 11:47 p.m. on March 14th, a Thursday night when the city was settling into the particular quiet that comes after midnight approaches. The call duration would later be recorded as 48 seconds. The dispatcher's name was Thomas Reeves, 23 years old, 3 months into his position. This detail, his inexperience, would become the hinge upon which an entire investigation would turn. The caller was Natalie Morrison, a woman who would remember almost nothing about this conversation except that she screamed, "There's someone in my house," she said. Her voice was not panicked. It was something quieter than panic. It was the voice of someone whose mind had not yet caught up to what her body already understood. Thomas Reeves looked at his screen. He had been trained to enter information into the system as calls came in, to remain calm, to follow protocol. He began typing. "Can you tell me the nature of your emergency?" he asked. There's someone here. He has a..." Her voice cut off, not ended. Cut off, as if someone had placed their hand over the phone. Then she was back. "He's here. He came through the window. I don't know what he wants," Thomas typed. Address confirmed. 4127 Riverside Avenue, Philadelphia. Caller in danger. Possible home invasion. Suspicious male on premises. He was following protocol. He was doing his job. What he did not do was ask the next question. What he did not do was ask where in the house she was. What he did not do was ask if she had a safe place to go. What he did not do was listen to the silence underneath her words. "I'm sending police to your location," he said. "Try to stay calm." "He's getting closer," she said. The line went dead. The call ended at 11:48 p.m. Thomas Reeves entered the information into the system, marked it as a priority dispatch, and alerted the nearest patrol units. Officers arrived at 4127 Riverside Avenue at 11:54 p.m., 6 minutes later. By then, it was too late. By then, the man was gone, and Natalie Morrison lay in her bedroom with a knife wound to her abdomen, bleeding steadily into the carpet, waiting for help that arrived only after the bleeding had become fatal. Her name was Natalie Morrison, 31 years old. She worked as a clinical psychologist. She had a daughter who was 6 years old, staying at her mother's house for the night. She had a cat that was very old and very affectionate. She liked to read before sleep. She was in excellent health, except for a mild peanut allergy and a tendency toward anxiety. She did everything right. She called 911. She followed the dispatcher's instructions. She was polite and calm in the face of a catastrophic emergency. She did everything a person is supposed to do. And she still died. The investigation into Natalie Morrison's death would have been routine if it had remained what it appeared to be. A home invasion gone wrong, perhaps a robbery, perhaps something else. The police would have searched for evidence. They would have compiled a list of known criminals in the area. They would have knocked on doors and asked questions. They would have eventually either solved the case or filed it away in the cold case database, one of the hundreds of unsolved homicides that accumulate in Philadelphia like sediment. But something changed the moment the detectives listened to the 911 recording. The voice on that recording was not the voice of a man committing a sudden violent crime. It was something far more deliberate. It was something far more practiced. Detective Marcus Johnson, who had 17 years of homicide experience and a reputation for stubborn precision, was the one who first said it aloud. He was sitting in the interrogation room with Thomas Reeves, the dispatcher, 3 days after Natalie Morrison's body was discovered. By this time, the story had already made the local news. By this time, there were suggestions that the police had failed her. By this time, there were questions about why 6 minutes had elapsed between the 911 call and the arrival of officers. "You didn't ask where she was in the house," Johnson said. He was not accusatory. He was simply stating a fact. He had the transcript in front of him. He had listened to the recording 17 times. Thomas Reeves was pale. He had not slept well in 3 days. He was beginning to understand that his job, which he had thought was simple and clear, might not be as simple as he had believed. "I followed protocol," he said. "Protocol requires you to establish the caller's location and immediate safety status," Johnson said. "Do you know what she said after you told her police were coming?" Reeves did not answer. "She said, 'He's getting closer.' Those were her last words. And you didn't ask where she was. You didn't know if she was in a room she could lock. You didn't know if she could get to a neighbor's house. You didn't know if there was a weapon accessible to her. You didn't know anything about her actual situation except that there was a suspicious male on her premises, and she was frightened. I was following the procedure. The procedure was written to handle general emergencies. It wasn't written for the specific situation of a woman alone in her home with an unknown assailant. The procedure doesn't account for the fact that sometimes a 6-minute response time is the difference between alive and dead." This conversation, which was intended to be a routine debrief, became something else. It became the opening argument in what would eventually be a much larger conversation about systems failure, institutional inertia, and the gap between protocol and reality. But that conversation was still weeks away. First, there was the matter of finding the man who had entered Natalie Morrison's house through the bedroom window at approximately 11:45 p.m. on a Thursday night. The evidence from the scene was sparse but meaningful. The window in the bedroom had been forced open from the outside. There were scratches on the frame and small amounts of broken glass on the interior sill. There was no corresponding glass on the exterior, which suggested the window had been broken as the intruder came inside, not before. He had broken it as a final act, not as preparation. There were no signs of forcible entry anywhere else in the house, no doors forced, no locks tampered with. This meant he had come through the window deliberately, having apparently scoped out the house beforehand or simply taken an opportunistic chance. The police found no evidence of extensive searching. Nothing was obviously missing. Nothing was disturbed except in the bedroom where Natalie Morrison lay. The knife had not been found. The police theorized it was either discarded somewhere nearby or taken by the perpetrator. They dredged storm drains. They searched a 3-block radius. They found nothing that matched. What they did find in the bedroom was blood that did not belong to Natalie Morrison. DNA evidence, Detective Johnson knew, required time. The blood would need to be processed. It would need to be compared against the state and federal databases. Even with expedited processing, it would take days, possibly weeks. The Millbrook Police Department for this was Millbrook, Pennsylvania, not Philadelphia proper, a suburban community northwest of the city center with its own police force and a reputation for being safe, did not have the resources for immediate analysis. What Millbrook did have was a surveillance camera network that had been installed 2 years prior as part of a community safety initiative. The cameras were on primary roads, at major intersections, and covering the areas surrounding schools and parks. 4127 Riverside Avenue was a residential street, not a primary road. No camera directly covered the house, but a camera approximately 1 block away, mounted on the corner of Riverside and Oak, captured a portion of the street. Detective Johnson pulled the footage himself, spending 6 hours in a small room watching video from midnight to 1 a.m. on March 14th. He watched cars pass. He watched a drunk man walking toward his home. He watched an empty street. He watched night traffic that meant nothing until it meant everything. At 11:32 p.m., a figure approached the house from the direction of the wooded area adjacent to Riverside Avenue. The footage was grainy. The resolution was poor. But the figure was male, and the figure was moving with purpose. He was wearing a dark jacket and jeans. His face was not visible, but his gait was distinctive, a peculiar kind of confident stride, the walk of someone who knew exactly where he was going. The figure disappeared from the camera's field of vision after 14 seconds. The camera's angle meant it could not track him all the way to the Morrison house. But the timeline was close enough. Johnson marked the timestamp. 11:32 p.m., 13 to 15 minutes before the 911 call. What was the intruder doing for those 13 minutes? This became the central question of the investigation. 13 minutes before Natalie Morrison called 911, a man approached her house. 13 minutes during which he apparently stood outside, or possibly entered, or possibly simply watched. 13 minutes of preparation or reconnaissance or something else entirely. The police canvassed the neighborhood. They found Natalie Morrison's neighbors, a middle-aged couple named the Hartleys, on the left side of the house. An older man named Vincent Paulson on the right. The Hartleys had heard nothing. They were asleep. Vincent Paulson, who was something of an insomniac, said he had heard nothing either, though he admitted he had been watching television in his front room and might not have noticed an unusual sound. She was a nice woman, Vincent Paulson said to the detective who interviewed him. Always polite, kept to herself. I didn't know her well. She didn't have many people over. Sometimes her mother would visit. Sometimes there was a man, but I think that was just a friend or someone she knew from work. This detail that there was sometimes a man was pursued aggressively. The detectives obtained Natalie Morrison's phone records and her calendar. They discovered that she had been seeing someone, a man named David Sutton, an accountant who lived 2 neighborhoods over. They interviewed David Sutton. David Sutton was 52 years old. He had been divorced for 10 years and lived alone in a townhouse. He said he and Natalie had been dating for 3 months. He said their relationship had been friendly but not serious. He said he was in his home watching television at the time of the murder. He said no, he had not been to her house that night. He said yes, she had a key to his house, but no, he did not have a key to hers. She had not offered one. He answered every question directly. He did not seem nervous. He did not seem evasive. He seemed like a man who was sad and shocked and cooperating with the police because it was the right thing to do. But Detective Johnson learned something important. From interviewing David Sutton, he learned that Natalie Morrison had been worried about someone. She had not said who. She had mentioned to David on several occasions that she thought someone had been in her house. Nothing had been taken, nothing had been disturbed, but she had the sense that someone had been there. She had changed the locks. She had considered getting an alarm system, but hadn't yet. She had mentioned it as an aside, not as something that terrified her, but as something that nagged at her. Did she seem afraid? Johnson asked. David Sutton considered this carefully. Not afraid. Exactly. Anxious, maybe. Like something wasn't right, but she didn't know what. I told her to call the police, but she said there was nothing to report. No evidence, no theft, just a feeling. This changed things. This transformed the crime from a random violent intrusion into something more calculated. Someone had been watching Natalie Morrison. Someone had entered her house, perhaps multiple times, leaving no evidence but enough disturbance that she had noticed. Someone had been studying her patterns, learning her routines, preparing for whatever came on the night of March 14th. This was not a burglary that had turned violent. This was premeditation. The DNA from the blood found at the scene came back 2 weeks later. It belonged to Marcus Ashford, age 37, with a criminal record that included assault, breaking and entering, and attempted rape. Ashford had spent 12 years in Pennsylvania prisons and been released 7 years prior. He was currently unemployed and living in a transitional housing facility in Philadelphia. He was also currently living approximately 1.3 miles from Natalie Morrison's house. The police found him 3 days later at the transitional housing facility. He tried to run. He was apprehended after a brief chase through the streets of Millbrook. He was arrested and charged with murder in the first degree. Everything should have been simple at this point. A man with a history of violent crime, DNA evidence, a clear motive: sexual assault interrupted or completed, a panic that resulted in violence. The case was open and shut, except it wasn't. Because Marcus Ashford, when confronted with the evidence, offered a confession that didn't match the crime. "I was there," he said. He was sitting in an interrogation room, his public defender beside him, his hands folded on the table in front of him. "I went to the house, but I didn't kill her. She was already dying when I got there." Detective Johnson, who had been standing in the observation room watching through the one-way glass, felt something shift in his understanding of the evening. He moved into the interrogation room. "Explain that," he said. Marcus Ashford looked up. He had the face of a man who had spent significant time in prison, lined, hardened, somehow simultaneously aged and hollowed out. His eyes, though, were clear. They were not the eyes of someone who was fabricating. "I knew the neighborhood," Ashford said. "I grew up a few blocks from there. I was released 7 years ago. I've been staying at the housing facility. I've been trying to get my life together. But I've also been dealing with some things." He paused. His public defender placed a hand on his arm, a gesture that might have been restraining or might have been supportive. "I had been watching the neighborhood, not for any reason. I was just there sometimes, walking, thinking, and I saw her. This woman with dark hair, running in the mornings. She was," he searched for a word, "safe, somehow. She seemed like someone who had her life together. Someone who was okay. And I wasn't okay. I was struggling." "So you decided to break into her house?" Johnson said. "I decided to see inside her house. I wanted to see what a life that was okay looked like. I knew it was wrong. I knew it was a crime. But I went to the house that night. I broke the window. I was going to just look around and then leave. That's all I was going to do. And when I came through the window, the bedroom light was on. She was there. She was lying in the bed, and there was blood, and she was very still. At first, I thought she was dead. Then she turned her head and looked at me. She tried to scream, but I think she knew that screaming wouldn't help. I think she knew that something had already happened to her." Detective Johnson felt the case reorganizing itself inside his mind. "Describe her condition." "She had a wound in her abdomen. There was a lot of blood. I think she had already called for help. I could hear her phone or the sound of her voice from somewhere in the house. And I understood that someone else had already been there. Someone else had already done this. I was interrupting something that was already in progress. So you left." "I left. I was panicked. I didn't know what to do. I had broken into a dying woman's home. I was already a felon. I already had a history. I knew that if I stayed, if I called for help, I would be blamed for this. I was terrified. So I ran." There was a silence in the interrogation room. Johnson and Ashford's public defender both believed, simultaneously, that Ashford was telling the truth. The belief was not based on hard evidence. It was based on the peculiar recognition that sometimes accompanies genuine confession, the sense that a person is describing something they have actually experienced rather than fabricating a narrative to avoid consequences. But truthfulness was not a legal defense, neither was panic, and Ashford's DNA was at the scene, and he had broken into the house, and he had fled. However, his truthfulness created a problem. If Marcus Ashford had not wounded Natalie Morrison, then someone else had. Someone else had been in her house. Someone else had stabbed her. Someone else had then left, allowing Ashford to arrive moments later, to see her dying, and to flee in terror. Which meant that the killer was still unknown. Which meant that the 911 call, that 48-second conversation between Natalie Morrison and Thomas Reeves, might contain the only direct evidence of the killer's presence. Detective Johnson returned to the 911 recording. He had listened to it dozens of times, but now he listened with new ears. Now he was not listening for information about a simple home invasion. He was listening for information about a crime of deliberate premeditation. The recording was still brief, still 48 seconds. But within those 48 seconds, there were sounds beneath the obvious sounds. There was a hum of machinery. There was breathing. There was the specific acoustic quality of a woman's voice delivered under extreme duress. "There's someone in my house," she said. Thomas Reeves responded, "Can you tell me the nature of your emergency? There's someone here. He has a—" And then she cut off. There was background noise during that cutoff. There was a sound that might have been movement, a shuffle, a step, a person moving through a room. Then, "He's here. He came through the window. I don't know what he wants, Thomas Reeves. I'm sending police to your location. Try to stay calm." And then, in the final moments, "He's getting closer." The line went dead. Thomas Reeves was brought back in for further questioning. This time, Detective Johnson brought an audio engineer with him, a woman named Sarah Chen, who specialized in forensic acoustics. They had her listen to the recording multiple times. They asked her what she heard. "There's a man's voice in the background during the cutoff," Chen said. "Very faint, but it's there. He's saying something. I can't make out the words, but the tone is conversational, not threatening. He sounds like he's speaking normally." "Play it again," Johnson said. They played it again, and again. And then Thomas Reeves, listening to his own recording with the audio engineer's observation in mind, heard something he had not heard before. The man's voice. Natalie Morrison's responses had been to someone who was present in the room with her, someone who was speaking to her, someone who was not simply an intruder, but someone who was engaged in a conversation while creating an emergency. "He said something," Chen said. "I think he said, 'Tell them you don't know who I am,' or maybe, 'Tell them I'm a stranger.'" The exact words are difficult to isolate from the audio compression. Johnson felt the implications of this shift his understanding entirely. The killer was not simply an intruder. The killer was someone who was giving Natalie Morrison instructions about what to say to the police. The killer was someone who was coaching her through the 911 call, managing her responses, shaping the narrative that the police would receive. This was a crime committed by someone who understood police investigation, someone who understood that 911 calls would be recorded, someone who understood that what he said in those 48 seconds would shape the immediate police response. This was strategic violence. This was murder planned, not just in terms of the moment of death, but in terms of the investigation that would follow. "Pull Thomas Reeves' training records," Johnson said to his partner, Detective Patricia Morales. "I want to know exactly what protocol he was operating under, and I want to know if there was any protocol that would have allowed him to interrupt, to push back, to ask clarifying questions when the caller's responses were being controlled by someone else." Patricia Morales was a detective with 14 years of experience, and she understood immediately what Johnson was asking. He was not asking whether Thomas Reeves had made a mistake. He was asking whether the system itself had failed, whether the protocols that governed 911 dispatchers were designed to handle a situation in which a caller's words were not entirely their own. The answer, when they obtained it, was no. The Millbrook Police Department had 12 911 dispatchers. They worked in a small office adjacent to the main police station. They had been trained according to state protocol, which mandated that dispatchers collect basic information: location, nature of emergency, caller's safety status, and dispatch appropriate response. The protocol was designed to be efficient. It was designed to be clear. It was designed to minimize time between call and dispatch. What it was not designed to do was to identify and interrogate instances in which the caller's words might not be their own. Thomas Reeves had done nothing wrong according to protocol. He had collected the address. He had identified the emergency. He had dispatched police. He had performed his job as defined. But in performing his job, he had become a conduit for a killer's voice. He had relayed to the 911 system information that had been shaped and controlled by the person committing the crime. He had not asked the questions that might have revealed the manipulation. He had not pushed for clarification that might have disrupted the killer's control of the situation. "I didn't know," Thomas Reeves said when confronted with this analysis. He was 23 years old. He had worked as a dispatcher for 3 months. He had no training in hostage negotiation or criminal psychology. He had been trained to take information, not to analyze it. "I followed protocol. I followed everything I was supposed to do. Protocol failed you, Detective Johnson said. It was not accusatory. It was observational. And it may have cost Natalie Morrison her life. The breakthrough came 6 weeks into the investigation, when a woman named Ellen Rothstein called the Millbrook Police Department with a story that seemed unrelated to the Morrison case. Ellen Rothstein was 43 years old. She lived in a different neighborhood, approximately 4 miles from Natalie Morrison's house. She worked as a financial advisor. She was calling to report that she thought someone had been in her house. Detective Johnson took the call himself. He was careful. He was methodical. He asked Ellen Rothstein the questions that Thomas Reeves had not asked Natalie Morrison. Where exactly was she when she called? In the hallway. Could she get outside? Possibly. Was anyone else in the house? No. Had she heard anyone recently? Yes, approximately 10 minutes ago. A sound of movement in the bedroom. Had she called 911 yet? No. She wanted to call him first. Hang up, Johnson said. Call 911 immediately. Tell them exactly what you told me. Make sure the dispatcher understands that you believe someone may still be in your house. Do not minimize the threat. Do not assume the dispatcher understands the severity of the situation. Keep the line open. Stay on the phone until police arrive. Do you understand? Ellen Rothstein understood. She called 911. She spoke to Thomas Reeves again. He was on duty that evening, and this time, knowing that there was a specific threat being investigated, knowing that the detectives were listening in real time, Thomas Reeves performed differently. He asked where she was. He asked if she could secure a room. He asked if she knew what direction the noise had come from. He kept her on the phone for 9 minutes, and during those 9 minutes, he communicated the severity of the situation to the responding officers in a way that resulted in an armed and rapid response. Police arrived in 4 minutes. They found no one in the house. They found no signs of entry. They found a bedroom window slightly ajar that might have been left that way by Ellen Rothstein herself. There was no physical evidence of an intruder, but there was something, a photograph that had been left on Ellen Rothstein's bedroom dresser. The photograph was of Ellen Rothstein, taken from outside her house, through the bedroom window, while she slept. The photograph was dated and time-stamped, March 23, 11:47 p.m., approximately 2 hours before she called the police. Ellen Rothstein had no memory of the photograph being placed there. She was certain it had not been there before. She was certain someone had been in her room, standing beside her bed, taking a photograph of her while she slept, and then placing the photograph on her dresser as a message. This photograph, more than any other evidence, convinced Detective Johnson that the Morrison murder was the opening act of something larger. Someone was hunting. Someone was selecting victims. Someone was crafting a narrative in which the police would be positioned exactly where he wanted them to be. The photograph was different from a 911 call. The photograph could not be controlled through manipulation or coaching. The photograph was direct communication. The photograph was a statement. I can access you. I can be in your most intimate space. I can document it. I can place evidence of my presence in your home, and you will find it, and you will know that I have been here. Natalie Morrison had called 911 because she had been wounded. Ellen Rothstein, who had been spared, had discovered the photograph because she had called the police proactively. The difference between these two outcomes was the difference between life and death. And the difference between the two 911 calls was the difference between a dispatcher who followed rote protocol and a dispatcher who understood, in real time, that the situation demanded more. The FBI became involved on March 29th, 2 weeks after Natalie Morrison's murder and 5 days after Ellen Rothstein's close encounter. The Bureau assigned a behavioral analyst named Dr. Sarah Voss, who had spent 20 years profiling serial offenders. Dr. Voss reviewed the evidence, the DNA from Marcus Ashford at the Morrison scene, the 911 recording, the analysis of the killer's voice, the photograph, the surveillance footage, the timeline. She produced a preliminary profile that was both specific and terrifying. "You're looking for someone with professional knowledge," she said in her report. "He understands police protocols. He understands 911 procedures. He may work in law enforcement, or he may have had training in this area. He's highly organized. His victim selection suggests he's been living in the area for months, possibly years. He's been observing his targets, learning their patterns, preparing for his approach. His confidence in conducting the Morrison murder while coaching her through the 911 call suggests he's done this before, or believes he has practiced enough that he knows what will happen next. His confidence has increased. With Ellen Rothstein, he's progressed to direct communication. He's moved from murder to demonstration. This suggests he's accelerating. He believes he has successfully manipulated the police response. He believes he's outsmarted the system. He's likely to strike again, and soon." Dr. Voss's report produced immediate action. The Millbrook Police Department began reviewing any personnel who had had access to 911 recordings or call logs in recent months. They reviewed police dispatchers, police administrators, security personnel. They expanded to review anyone who might have had tangential access to police information systems. The search widened. They looked for anyone with a profile, male, age 30 to 50, with training in law enforcement or emergency response, with access to police information, with a history in the neighborhood. They looked at 63 people. They found 23 with some connection to law enforcement or emergency services. They found 8 with actual access to police information systems. Of those 8, 5 had alibis for the night of the Morrison murder. 1 had been incarcerated. 2 remained viable. 1 was Robert Cassidy, a former Philadelphia police officer who had retired on medical grounds 8 years prior, after a knee injury that had ended his career. He was 51 years old. He lived alone in Millbrook. He had no police record. He had no criminal history. But he had access to police databases through his former position as a lieutenant. He would have known 911 protocols intimately. He would have understood how police dispatch worked. He would have understood how to manipulate it. They found, during a search of his house, copies of training materials for 911 dispatch procedures. They found a log of phone records showing calls made to the Millbrook area at specific times. They found driving directions to Natalie Morrison's address and Ellen Rothstein's address, printed from online maps 2 months prior. But they did not find the knife. They did not find the photograph. They did not find direct evidence linking him to either crime. They brought him in for questioning anyway. Robert Cassidy sat in the interrogation room and denied everything. He said the training materials were from his work as a police officer. He said the addresses had been printed as part of a community awareness project he had been working on. He was thinking about starting a neighborhood watch program. He said the phone calls were unrelated to any crime. He said he was surprised to be suspected, but he understood the police's need to investigate. He was polite, he was cooperative, he was consistent. But his answers did not explain everything. The timeline of when the materials had been printed, the specificity of the address locations, the pattern of phone calls that corresponded to dates when other women in the neighborhood had reported feelings of being watched. Detective Johnson sat across from him and realized that he had no direct evidence, no DNA, no physical evidence recovered from Cassidy's home that matched the scene, no recording of Cassidy's voice that could be compared to the voice on the 911 recording, no witness testimony placing him at the scene. All he had was pattern, opportunity, profile. All he had was the sense that the man sitting across from him understood the system well enough to evade it. "I want to ask you something," Johnson said, "and I want you to think carefully before you answer." Robert Cassidy waited. "During your years as a police officer, did you ever become frustrated with how investigations proceeded? Did you ever feel like the system was inefficient? Did you ever think that you could do something better than the system?" Robert Cassidy smiled. It was a small smile. It was not the smile of someone who was amused. It was the smile of someone who had been asked a question by someone who thought they understood the answer. "I loved being a police officer," he said. "I was good at it. And then a car accident took that away from me. I lost my job. I lost my career. I lost the thing that made me feel like I was capable of understanding the world in a way other people weren't." He paused. "Everyone needs to feel capable of something," he said. "What did you expect me to do?" The breakthrough came not from police investigation, but from accident. A maintenance worker at the Philadelphia Emergency Response Center, the centralized 911 dispatch hub that serviced multiple municipalities, including Millbrook, was replacing an old computer system when he discovered archived files from a backup drive. Among those files were call recordings that had been backed up to the system, but never properly deleted. The recordings included calls that predated the Morrison murder by 3 months. One of those calls was from a woman named Linda Vasquez, who had called to report a break-in at her home. The call had lasted 93 seconds. During the call, a man's voice could be heard in the background, speaking to her, coaching her, shaping her responses to the dispatcher. The voice was Robert Cassidy's. Linda Vasquez had died in that break-in. She had been stabbed 4 times. Her death had been attributed to a random home invasion by an unknown assailant. She had been dead for 2 years before anyone recognized the pattern. The archived backup revealed 2 more calls, 2 more victims, 2 more instances of Cassidy's voice coaching the victim through the 911 call, 2 more women who had died in circumstances that had initially been classified as random violent crimes. In total, across 6 years, Robert Cassidy had murdered at least 5 women. He had staged their deaths as random break-ins. He had coached them through 911 calls in which they unknowingly provided the narrative that would misdirect police investigation. He had used the 911 system itself as a tool of his crime, and he had nearly gotten away with it, would have gotten away with it, if not for the accidental discovery of archived files and the willingness of a detective to look backward at old cases with new eyes. Robert Cassidy was arrested on April 5th. He was charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder. He confessed to all of them. He did not express remorse. He did not appear to experience emotion when describing the murders. He spoke about his crimes as though they were projects he had completed, tasks he had accomplished. The trials took 2 years. The prosecution was meticulous. The evidence was overwhelming. Cassidy was convicted on all counts. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. But the investigation did not end with his conviction. The investigation expanded into something larger. It became an investigation not of Robert Cassidy, but of the systems that had allowed him to operate for 6 years without detection. The archived 911 calls, which had been backed up automatically but never reviewed, should have been discoverable. There should have been protocols for reviewing old calls when cases remained unsolved. There should have been cross-referencing of victim statements against known voices. There should have been training for dispatchers to recognize indicators that a caller's words were being controlled or coached. None of these things existed. The Philadelphia Emergency Response Center, which had been operating on systems that were, in some cases, nearly 20 years old, had no quality control mechanism. Dispatchers were not regularly monitored. There was no feedback system that informed dispatchers whether their calls had resulted in effective police response. There was no training beyond the initial certification that taught dispatchers to recognize manipulation or danger signs. Thomas Reeves, the dispatcher who had taken Natalie Morrison's 911 call, was devastated when these failures were revealed. He had been following protocol. He had been doing his job. But the system that defined his job was fundamentally inadequate for the complex emergencies it was required to manage. The death of Natalie Morrison and the capture of Robert Cassidy became a catalyst for systematic change in Philadelphia's emergency response system. The city initiated a comprehensive review of 911 protocols. They implemented mandatory quality control monitoring of all dispatchers. They created specialized training for identifying caller distress. that went beyond simple verbal expression. They implemented a system in which all 911 calls were tagged with incident classifications that made cross-referencing possible. They created a team specifically tasked with analyzing old unsolved cases, looking for patterns that might indicate serial predators. They developed a new protocol for dispatchers, the escalation protocol. Under this protocol, if a dispatcher identified any indicators that a caller's words might be coached or controlled, they were required to attempt to interrupt the coaching by asking specific questions designed to establish independent caller agency. Questions like, "Are you alone right now? Is there someone in the room with you? Are you speaking freely, or is someone telling you what to say?" These were not guaranteed to be safe for the caller. In some cases, revealing the coaching relationship might escalate the perpetrator's violence. But the new protocol recognized that sometimes the danger of remaining silent was greater than the danger of intervention. The Philadelphia Police Department increased funding for forensic analysis and archived evidence review. They implemented a specialized unit dedicated to analyzing 911 recordings for background voices, coached responses, and indicators of manipulation. These changes were expensive. These changes required training and infrastructure investment. These changes meant hiring additional personnel and implementing new computer systems. But these changes were implemented because the alternative was that more women like Natalie Morrison would die, and their deaths would be preventable. Natalie Morrison's daughter, Emma, was 6 years old when her mother was murdered. She is 14 now. She lives with her maternal grandmother, who has raised her with the love and stability that Emma needed after losing her mother. Emma is a good student. She is thoughtful and resilient. She does not remember much about her mother's death, though she remembers her mother clearly, the sound of her voice, the way she laughed, the feeling of being held by her. Emma is considering a career in criminal justice. She is thinking about becoming a detective, or perhaps a prosecutor. She wants to understand how the systems that are supposed to protect us sometimes fail, and how to make them better. The changes to Philadelphia's 911 system have been documented, studied, and adopted by police departments in 17 other states. The escalation protocol is taught in police dispatch training programs across the country. The model of archived call review has become standard practice. The recognition that 911 dispatchers are not merely call takers, but participants in the investigation of potential crimes, has transformed how emergency response is understood. None of these changes existed on March 14th, the night that Natalie Morrison called 911 and spoke her last words into a system that was not designed to hear what she was really saying. But they exist now. They exist because she died. They exist because her daughter survived her death, and will grow up in a world where the systems are slightly better, slightly more attentive, slightly more capable of recognizing when danger is being masked as something ordinary. Detective Marcus Johnson retired from the Millbrook Police Department 5 years after Robert Cassidy's conviction. On his last day, he requested access to the archived 911 recordings. He wanted to listen to the 5 calls that Robert Cassidy had made, to listen to the voices of the 5 women who had died, to listen to the moments when the system had failed them. He listened to Natalie Morrison's voice, "There's someone in my house." And then, 48 seconds later, the moment when the line went dead, he listened to Linda Vasquez's voice, dating back 2 years, nearly unheard for a decade. "I don't know who's here. I'm afraid." And Cassidy's voice in the background, steady and calm, coaching her through the end of her life. Johnson did not cry. He had not cried throughout the investigation, throughout the trials, throughout the years of trying to explain to people how a system could fail so completely that a predator could commit murder through the police department's own emergency response network. But he felt, in that moment, the weight of those 48 seconds. He felt the tragedy of a woman trying to get help, speaking to a dispatcher who could not see what was happening, and dying in the gap between her words and the system's inability to understand them. When he finished listening to the recordings, he walked out of the police station for the last time. He did not look back, but he carried with him the knowledge that every change made to Philadelphia's 911 system was, in some way, Natalie Morrison's voice continuing to speak. Every dispatcher who paused to ask if a caller was speaking freely was hearing the echo of her words. Every protocol that required attention to the nuance beneath the surface of a 911 call was, in some sense, a conversation with the dead. The system would never be perfect. No system protecting human beings ever could be. But it was better. It was more attentive. It was slightly more capable of recognizing danger hidden within calm voices. And that small improvement in the city's capacity to listen, that was Natalie Morrison's legacy. That was what her death had purchased. A system that listened harder, questioned more carefully, and recognized that sometimes the most important information in an emergency call is what is not being said directly, but is being said through silence, through hesitation, through the particular acoustic properties of a voice that is not entirely its own. On the night that Natalie Morrison called 911 and spoke her last words, the system had failed her. The system had been designed by people who could not imagine the specific form of danger she was facing, who could not conceive of a predator who was sophisticated enough to use the police's own emergency response network against them. But the system that exists now is different. The system listens differently. The system is designed by people who have learned, through tragedy, what questions to ask. And somewhere, in the memory of Philadelphia's emergency dispatch center, the recordings remain. 5 voices, 6 years of silence, and the slow transformation of a system into something slightly more human, slightly more attentive, and slightly more capable of hearing the things that people say when they are afraid.